Joining us now, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, who's here with me in New York. Also with us, former Congress members Barbara Comstock and David Jolly. Great to have all of you here. Vaughn, let's just start with these different messages that we're hearing from the two men who want to win back the White House, essentially. I mean, Trump has made a point to really appeal to the evangelical base. He's out there selling Bibles now, and this is how he spends Easter. This is his message on Easter Sunday.
It was quite something watching Easter unfold yesterday for anybody following Truth Social account of Donald J. Trump. Look, he had multiple posts in which he was promoting pieces that were mocking the Transgender Day of Visibility. There were more than 75 posts in total. Another one, he quote, on all caps, said, "Happy Easter to all, including those many people that I completely and totally despise because they want to destroy America." He posted another allies message that stated, quote, "It's also not a crime to twist political arms," which linked to a New York Times story last week that detailed how Donald Trump told Mike Pence that certifying the 2020 election would be a, quote, career killer. He posted another piece by a right-wing ally in which it referred to, quote, the crucifixion of Donald Trump. Another piece that he posted, it had, quote, the chosen one, in which this is a part of this piece that a Trump ally wrote. "Do you believe in miracles? It's time to start believing. What's happening is supernatural. Everyone is starting to see it. Everyone is starting to believe. The signs are there. Trump is, quote, the chosen one. Trump is set by God and blessed by God." Again, the former president himself posting that article. Trump continues to turn to religious imagery to try to legitimize his grievances. I want to let everybody take a listen, though, to President Biden this morning talking with our colleague Al Roker outside of the Easter egg roll.
I just think people are so tired of the negativity that is propagated that they just want to get engaged. They want to change things. And I'm optimistic. I really am.
That's President Biden talking about optimism. Donald Trump has a little different version of optimism here, but it's one that the American public is going to see in great contrast over these next 7 months, if Easter is any sign of that.
Congressman Jolly, just your thoughts on these contrasting messages. Are Americans, should Americans be optimistic? Are they tired of the stuff that Trump is posting?
I think they are. And let's be honest, I think millions of Americans saw yesterday and were reminded of somebody they see as an unwell and angry man. And frankly, that hits among a political demographic that Donald Trump should be worried about going into November. His attacks on the transgender community are arguably theologically very unsound, but also politically ridiculous. Why would you be out there with a megaphone saying, "I want to deny equity and inclusivity to fellow Americans" on a day when people should be celebrating what brings them together through faith? Politically, what is most important about this, and I think what Joe Biden is referring to, we talk about this being a coalition election, right? Joe Biden needs the mainline Dems, the progressive Dems, the persuadables, the independent soft Republicans. Trump needs a mirror image of that on his side. Those persuadables, one of the reasons they are questioning whether they can vote for Donald Trump again is they're tired of him, and they're tired of his anger and his antics, much less his threats to the institutions that keep our country together. Joe Biden sees that in this mythical Nikki Haley voter, let's say. And so that coalition that could decide the election in 7 states is the coalition that looked at yesterday and said, "I don't think I want to go back to Donald Trump."
Let's, for a moment, just focus on his appeal with the evangelical voter, because I want you to listen to what Senator and Reverend Raphael Warnock said about Trump selling Bibles.
The Bible does not need Donald Trump's endorsement, and Jesus, in the very last week of his life, chased the money changers out of the temple.
Congresswoman Comstock, does he risk alienating the evangelical base by acting the way he is, selling Bibles on one hand, using religious holidays to attack opponents and prosecutors and judges and family members of theirs on the other?
Well, listen, the 7% in the 7 states that are going to decide the election are women. They are disproportionately women. They aren't necessarily evangelicals, which, yes, he could be turning them off. But the violent and ugly rhetoric that he used, for example, on Good Friday, that bound and gagged imagery of Joe Biden, that's the kind of thing that turns women off. The misogyny turns women off. You know, this weekend, Liz Cheney had a huge event where she was talking, about all of the problems of Donald Trump. And those ads that Joe Biden is now doing appealing to the Nikki Haley voters are very effective because they're also being complemented by ads that are targeting the very same people from Republicans against Trump. And we need to remember that there's almost no Republicans who served in Donald Trump's administration who support him, including his own vice president, who actually was probably in church yesterday, like I was. And Donald Trump, the Bible salesman, the huckster, the Elmer Gantry-esque Donald Trump does not appear to have been in church yesterday while he was doing that, screed of 70 plus posts attacking, I would note, Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, one of those swing states, and so when he goes in there and attacks people in Wisconsin, that's also Paul Ryan's home state. Paul Ryan's not supporting Donald Trump. So those 7 states, the 7% of people who are going to support him, he is turning them off every day. He's still attacking Ron DeSantis, who is somebody who's already endorsed him. So the real problem is the 7 states and all the Republicans he keeps attacking while Joe Biden's reaching out to people, and he's going to have a lot of Republicans who's going to be supporting him.
One of the things that he was putting on social media or sort of reposting that Vaughn mentioned was this article by Michael Bender of the New York Times, who wrote about the, quote, Church of Trump and Trump's evangelical base. And he quotes one supporter as saying, and I'm just going to reiterate this quote, Vaughn read it to you as well, but he's definitely been chosen by God. He's still surviving, even though all these people are coming after him. And I don't know how else to explain that other than divine intervention. That is a direct quote from one of Trump's evangelical supporters. Congressman Jolly, what's your reaction? Can Trump do no wrong with this group?
Well, I think it depends on how narrowly tailored we want to make the evangelical demographic, if you will. For many, they see Donald Trump as a perfect vessel despite his own imperfections. It's almost a tenet of the evangelical Christian movement. Somebody, despite all of his imperfections, who delivered the repeal of Roe in the Dobbs decision, or who gave them the judges. And so, they see God as working through Donald Trump despite his imperfections. At times, the vanity can go too far. I mean, I think many evangelicals look at Donald Trump's actions yesterday and say, is this a guy who feels like he's in competition with Jesus Christ? He was intimidated by the attention that Jesus got on Easter because the vanities on display are that raw, and it cuts against all the other teachings of the evangelical Christian movement. Like, I think the evangelical church will remain behind Donald Trump in lockstep. However, there is some bleed depending on how wide we make that lane. Take a post-Dobbs world. Some evangelical women are sitting in the pews yesterday saying, I'm not voting for Donald Trump because I actually think a Roe framework is better. Those losses, those voters matter to Joe Biden getting reelected.
Vaughn, let's talk about this post that's getting a lot of blowback and criticism, controversial post that we're not going to show because of how disturbing it is. It's a fake video of a fake picture of a bound President Biden in the back of a pickup truck. Is the Trump campaign responding at all to the blowback it's getting?
This is a moment here where Donald Trump, over the course of the last 9 years, is ever more in control of his own messaging. There is no walking back. There is no regret. Of campaigns past, there would be moments where, like, okay, campaign managers, candidate, they huddle together and they say, we got to fix this. There's going to be blowback, right? Donald Trump actively posted this video on his own social media account. We have seen violent imagery. We have heard that echoed by his supporters. All of this is the stakes of this election here, what Donald Trump calls the final battle of 2024. That was a decision to post that video. This for the campaign is Donald Trump's campaign. Donald Trump is going to continue to put out this sort of imagery. We have no reason not to believe that that is the case, and we have no reason to expect that there will be any walk back from his campaign from instances like this.
Congresswoman Comstock, how concerned are you about the potential for Trump's rhetoric or his posts to, again, inspire violence like we saw on January 6th? And I'm thinking about the people who have since been arrested and tried for crimes related to January 6th who said they were just doing what they thought Trump wanted them to do.
Well, I serve on the National Council of Election Integrity, and we're very concerned about the increased violence against members of Congress, Obviously, we're very concerned about, what happened on January 6th. We were formed before the 2020 election because we were concerned about potential violence, no matter what the outcome was going to be in the 2020 election. And I personally am very concerned about the extension of pardons that Donald Trump has already made to the January 6th, felons, people who have pled guilty, who said they were guilty of those crimes of attacking Capitol Hill police officers who I worked with. Many of those were my constituents, people who were assaulted, over 140 officers who were injured, who Donald Trump continues to, talk about them, those people who pled guilty as being hostages when we know they were violent criminals, and we've seen those pictures. So that is very disturbing when we know he's attacking judges, when he's attacking the families of judges, the current judge now this past week attacking his daughter. Those things are very disturbing because we know when he makes those type of attacks on people, those family members, people like my friend Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, they've had, death threats when Donald Trump, makes those attacks on them. He made that attack on Mike Gallagher.
Right.
Probably if you called Mike Gallagher, you will see that, attacks increased on him. We know during the speaker's battle when people went and said, hey, you've got to vote for Jim Jordan, there were death threats made against those who did not vote for Jim Jordan. So this is very troubling. It's an increasing problem, and it's why you're seeing members of Congress leave in droves because of that danger to them.
And Congressman Jolly, Politico is reporting that Republicans there on Capitol Hill are urging Trump to tamp down on the attacks on his rivals and his comments about January 6th. Yeah. He doesn't seem to be listening.
Yeah, and it's not working. And I would add to Barbara's comments that Donald Trump's out on bail right now in his criminal cases. He should be detained pre-trial if he's going to incite violence. And I think that's why Republicans are so concerned right now. They thought they were going to be in a very different place right now. They thought they would have Joe Biden impeached. They did not expect Donald Trump to be on trial, and they thought the economy would be in the tank. None of that has happened. Republicans are worried right now. Donald Trump, too much vanity to realize he's in trouble, but Republicans on the Hill know he is, and he is off message every time he steps out in front of the voters that he needs. That's why Republicans are worried, and they should be.
And Congresswoman Comstock, coming back to something you touched on earlier, this caught my eye in Politico, writing, quote, while independents and crossover voters may have boosted former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley in some of the primaries, a chunk of true Republican voters still wished for someone else to be the party's nominee. So just take the sum total of everything we talked about today. And is Donald Trump doing what he needs to do to land those crossover independent voters?
Oh, no, listen, in the words of Taylor Swift, we are never, ever getting back together again. That's why you're seeing, even with Nikki Haley not being in the race, you're still seeing, 14, 15% of those voters making that protest vote. And of course, Donald Trump is still attacking Nikki Haley. As I mentioned, he and his campaign are still attacking Ron DeSantis, who endorsed him. He's saying, we don't need your voters. Remember, he very famously said, if you support Nikki Haley, you are permanently barred.
Right, from the MAGA movement.
Permanently barred. You're not going to see many of those Nikki Haley supporters support him. I certainly won't be. I know David won't be either. And so that's why, I was in a swing district. Those 7% of voters, most of them in those swing states, they are not going to be open to supporting Nikki Haley, which is why, supporting Donald Trump. Those Nikki Haley voters, that's why that ad that Joe Biden has up right now is very wise. And hopefully they'll be reaching out in those swing states like in Pennsylvania and Michigan. In 2022, Josh Shapiro and Gretchen Engler had huge support from Republicans in both of those states. You look at, they had huge rosters of Republicans, elected Republicans who supported them, from supervisors all the way up to former governors, and I think Joe Biden will too.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon. and enjoy it.